Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to what if everything went terrible for the USA. And I mean, I think this is just basically events in like important events in US's history, and it's basically if they didn't go how they eventually went, because I think pretty much everything in the US history went well. Obviously there's things that didn't go well, but in terms of building it to the country it is now, a lot of things, wars, pretty much wars and stuff like that, they pretty much all went well for the US. But there is also a video from the channel of what if everything went perfect for the USA, I think. And I mean, I guess I'll check that one out as well if you'd be interested in that. But this is just, I guess, a look at what an alternate universe would be like if they didn't win these wars or it didn't go well for them, and all these things. But we're going to check this out. Hopefully you're going to enjoy. Links are in the description to my Patreon, where you can see reactions to videos that I can't post to YouTube. And let's check this out and see what this video is about.
Today, I bring you a twist on my What If Everything Goes Perfect series. Its evil twin, What If Everything Goes Terrible. Now this is significantly harder than the perfect series. For the perfect one, just have nations make logical decisions based on hindsight, and have them get rich, big and powerful. The terrible series is way harder, because right off the bat, the US loses their war of independence and simply doesn't exist. There you go, video is done. Obviously, this would be rather boring. So instead, this video will be an experiment. I will offer multiple timelines and multiple points where things may have gone terribly wrong for the US. Our first scenario finds us in 1776, the start of the American Revolution.
There we go.
The militias are fighting bravely against the British armies, led by their leader, Washington. But British forces land back on the continent and manage to wipe the floor with the Americans. In an unfortunate engagement, the great leader of the revolutionaries gets captured, destroying American morale. The British king then realizes pure military force will never fully defeat this revolt. So, the British offer compromise to the revolutionaries. With the military situation further deteriorating, the Spanish and the French don't put major resources in aiding the revolutionaries. So eventually, the revolution pretty much gets defeated. The Brits and the Americans reach an agreement, allowing for significantly more autonomy for the colonists. The United States simply never exists.
I still think it would have just led to the US being existing, because over time they would have just been fighting more, and the more power this area would have got, the more they would fight for their freedom. And then eventually they would. I feel like that would have always happened, right? But maybe it would have just been a bit further down the line. Not much further, but maybe a bit, like a good 50, 60 years further down the line. But who actually knows? I mean, you're never going to know this sort of stuff, but that's just sort of what I think. I mean, this never happened, right? But this is just a look at what it would have been like.
Which is sure to be pretty bad for the US. Our next scenario brings us to the War of 1812.
Okay, so at this point the US has now been created, so that's cool. And I like how he's doing it at different sort of points like this.
Newly independent US starts a war with Britain again, hoping to seize Canada from them. But oh, does this fail in the most spectacular way. The American invasion force gets cut off and destroyed, followed up with Britain starting a devastating naval blockade of the Americans. Despite the British still busy fighting Napoleon, they also muster the forces to launch a devastating attack on New York, then capturing Washington and burning down the White House. American attempts to reclaim the territories are rebuffed. And to make it even worse, the British capture Louisiana, devastating American usage of the Mississippi River. The British have proven that they can still dominate the young state, even while dealing with one of the greatest generals of all time. Meanwhile, over in the north, Tecumseh is leading a native resistance to the US, supported by the British. Due to British backing, they too achieve major successes.
Damn.
And eventually, the Americans are simply forced to make peace.
Bro, the US, in this timeline, the US cannot catch a break, man. It cannot catch a break.
And the peace would be devastating. The natives of the Northwest gain independence. The Brits force a change in the main border, but most devastatingly, the Louisiana territory is returned to the Spanish, at least for now. The American experiment has been smashed down, and Britain is making it very difficult for them to expand further. Even if Spain loses Louisiana to a massive new Mexican state, the British will prevent American reconquest. But things escalate as the slavery dispute comes into play. As the US stews on their east coast, abolition is gaining traction across the world. The South absolutely dominates this alternate US, and they try to enshrine slavery into US law. Egged on by Britain, it's actually the North that secedes, in a much less bloody civil war, splitting the US in two. The US, now just the South, is ruled by aristocratic elites, building up a state that only benefits the white landowners, more and more out of touch with the realities of the world, falling behind the much more industrial North as well as Britain.
Damn.
Another way to achieve practically the same result is to not have the US surrender during the War of 1812. The Federalist Party in the North had already discussed declaring independence from the US, as the North was suffering the most from the blockade and the lack of trade with Britain. And should the government just absolutely refuse peace, despite all odds being against them, the Brits may just support the North getting independence, before, eventually, making peace with the US anyway. Again, we now have a South dominated by the aristocracy, while the North is in Britain's sphere of influence, and the rich West is in Mexico's control. Let's go back to the Revolutionary Wars. This time, they do manage to achieve victory over the British, but then the question arises...
I love how... So this is obviously a video of things going wrong, so you're sort of seeing a timeline of it going wrong, but then he's going into the future where it's obviously not gone wrong, and you're saying, oh, well, this is actually the reality, but still, we're going to just make it seem like they've lost all these things, all these wars, and it's just funny to just sort of look at that with the sort of the idea of them it going terribly, and then the reality of, nope, this didn't go terrible at all.
What's next? How do we structure our new states? The first attempt were the Articles of Confederation, which was pretty terrible. The US government got a number of tasks, but they received very little means to actually achieve those tasks, unable to effectively raise funds, control their borders, or anything really. So, the Constitutional Convention was called, and the famous words, "We the people," began the modern constitution. But what if the Articles of Confederation, for some reason, had simply remained in place? A critical mass of states decided that they don't want a more powerful central government. With the Articles of Confederation as the blueprint for the US, at no point does the state officially break up. But many states do start to drift apart, as they are a union only in name, working together on subjects only when the state thinks it would benefit them. In this form, the US never has the centralized leadership to rise to rival Britain, as the smaller state economies grow more dependent on Britain economically, as the US lacks the unity to come together and use their local advantage to push against their rivals. The US remains a not insignificant, but only regional power at best. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. All of the conclusions we have discussed so far are mostly plausible, and they have one thing in common. They happen in the early history of the US. The US went extremely quickly from East Coast nation to sea to shining sea nation. With all of this rich land, or even just all of this rich land, the US becomes practically unstoppable, especially if responsible democracy is established. The only real way to knock the US down from this position is to have Britain completely focus on bringing the US down. This is quite unlikely, as Britain has much more lucrative and easy target, making such an aggressive stance towards the US a waste of resources. So, after this point...
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, they were just probably focusing on other countries, and they're like, you know what, we've already tried it with you, we failed, and you're obviously getting more and more powerful. We'll just focus on these countries that are a lot easier to take advantage of and get rich from. And then I guess maybe by the point they were sort of thinking we could go back to the US and try again, if they did think like that, they're like, oh, they're too powerful now. There's probably no point doing this because we're going to fail again.
The US can absolutely still get weaker, but finding a truly terrible timeline is difficult. So, these next ones will be far more unrealistic than the ones that came before.
Okay.
The first one brings us all the way to the 1940s. The Germans absolutely rampaged around Europe, while the Japanese...
Switzerland, man. Switzerland really is just like, you know what, we're so neutral, we're not even getting invaded by the Nazis. That's wild, man.
Rampaged around Europe, while the Japanese are rampaging around China. But most worryingly, the British have already signed a peace treaty with Germany, leaving Europe to the Germans completely. The Soviets then are not led by the iron dictator Stalin, who despite all of his terrible flaws, did greatly build up Soviet industrial potential. Instead, Bukharin leads the Soviet Union. Soviet economic growth is a lot more healthy and a lot more agricultural, which may benefit Russia long term. But it is terrible at this moment. Without Germany at war with Britain, Lend-Lease never gets started either, as the American public cares not for supporting the communists. The Soviets, without a significant industrial base, get completely wiped out by the Germans, while the Japanese take advantage and seize the Soviet East. The Japanese are also significantly more successful in China, capturing Chongqing and basically destroying the organized Chinese forces.
Damn, a world without, I say without China, a world with Japan invaded China and the Soviet Union has been invaded by Japan and Germany. Imagine that. That'd be a complete. I mean, obviously by now it probably would have all changed still, but that would have just been a fascinating thought of like how history could have been.
Obviously, all sorts of resistance movements will still remain active, but the organized resistance is gone. So Europe is ruled by Germany, and the most populous state on Earth is ruled by the Japanese. The only remaining US ally is Britain, which is an island extremely vulnerable to the Germans, while Britain's worldwide empire, especially due to Japanese and German backing, see their empire unravel and weaken. So, despite us not changing anything about the US, the Americans are now one of 3 continent-spanning superpowers. The US, and indeed the whole world, is headed into a much more horrific future than our timeline. For the next timeline, we are headed back in time again, and we will change a single thing. George Washington, by all accounts, was so popular by the end of the American Revolution, he could have pretty much steered the nation in whatever direction he wanted. Luckily, he was humble, reluctant to take up power, and began a troubled but mostly successful democracy. But what if George Washington was a Napoleon? How do I mean this? Washington goes along with some aspects of liberalism, but in practice becomes either dictator.
We are very lucky that he was. I mean, I don't know how. If he did he have like at the end of the revolution and the independence. Sorry, the independence. Did he have all the power like for himself, or did other people around him also have sort of decisions to make? Because I mean, if he had all the power and he genuinely like that was how it was, then fair enough. Because it could have been a whole different landscape of what the world would be now, if he was a bit of a bad egg, let's say, a bit of a bad egg, to say the least. But thankfully he wasn't, and it didn't lead to that. Because again, say his morals were so different, and he did have all the power to decide what was going to happen. God damn, man, it would have been a dark place. I'm sure about that. Like, imagine the US. Sort of, I don't know how to say it, but like just being sort of that, like, I don't know how to say it, to be honest. Like, I want to say like just the Soviet Union of the world, and it was kind of like that in the US as well. It would just be fascinating. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, not in a good way, but the idea again is pretty fascinating.
Or king over the new state, to complete America's ideological decline, rather than a clear state and church split. Religion becomes an integral part of the American state. Like Napoleon did, certain rights and liberties would still be expanded. It wouldn't be a full absolutist monarchy, but the democratic experiment failed before it really got started. America may still rise to a powerful position in North America, even under their monarchy, but internally, the US is just like the European states of old, ruled by a single person with a powerful aristocracy holding power. In a worst case scenario, they could end up like another Brazil. For the international power of the US, this is by no means the worst outcome out of the bunch, but especially for the people within the US, this is quite a downgrade from our timeline.
For sure.
Then we travel back to 1945, where we will discuss just the first decade of what an American defeat in the Cold War scenario may look like.
So this is like a big one, I guess. This is going to be like obviously the more recent times, but it's going to sort of be, again, you're going to sort of see the effects of this like current day kind of thing. Like this is one, like if this happened and it went wrong, you'd be seeing this currently kind of like that.
Just to illustrate how much we would have to change to even have a chance of making this happen. First off, we have to change the Soviets, especially in the post-Stalin years. Giving the Soviets a more functional but still socialist system would be fundamental for the Soviets to not collapse. But then the real fun starts. Following the Allied victory in Asia, the Communists take control over all of China, managing to rush Taiwan before the West could respond. In Japan, the Emperor is trialed and killed by the Americans as a war criminal, radicalizing Japan and creating anti-American guerrillas. During this chaos, the newly established North Korea invades the newly established South Korea, overrunning and reunifying the peninsula. Due to the Communist Chinese full defeat of the nationalists, they take up the UN seat, meaning America doesn't get a UN coalition to help back the South. Over to Europe, we have the Soviets betray and occupy large portions of Yugoslavia, bringing them closer to the Soviet sphere. In Greece, a communist revolution is able to bring down the central government with Soviet help, practically securing all of Eastern Europe for the Soviets. But it gets better. The American Marshall Plan is rejected. America will not help Europe's recovery from this war. Not only does this make America weaker, it also makes Europe more sympathetic to the communists. In Italy, a socialist government is formed after the first election, same with France. These regimes are not puppets to Moscow, but they do form a neutral third bloc. In Germany, the lack of Marshall aid sees them not integrate into the Western world as willingly, while European integration projects wouldn't get on the way at all. Europe as a whole becomes way poorer than in our timeline. By this point, has the US already lost the Cold War? Absolutely not. But it is just a taste of the huge amount of dominoes I would need to knock over to even come close to having this happen. And that was our final scenario for today. For anyone wondering why I didn't include a scenario where the South becomes independent during the Civil War, it's simple. The surviving United States is still a behemoth, likely to become the most powerful state on Earth anyway. While the South is a backwards and likely weak state, pretty much certain to be reconquered somewhere down the line. This scenario may even lead to a more successful reconstruction, benefiting the US in the long term, depending on how long the South was independent for. It may be a setback for the US, but unless we change far more of history, it doesn't qualify as a terrible scenario. So that's it for this video.
It's a fascinating look into it for sure. Scenario idea: what if Burgundy won the Burgundian Wars and eventually became independent of France and had colonies? What if the Imperial Japanese Navy gained more political influence than the army over Japan before World War II? Why am I imagining these to have been the original scenarios and the USA just reloaded previous saves to get its modern hegemonic status, like in a Paradox game? Well, there we go. Obviously, this is all theory. It's not actually reality, but hopefully find this interesting. And that's pretty much it. Until next time. Peace.